The newsroom buzzed with the hum of typewriters and ringing telephones, a cacophony that should have been energizing but felt like white noise to Amelia Reed. She sat at her desk in the corner, clutching her pencil so tightly her knuckles turned white. Another rejection, another dismissed pitch. "This is good, Amelia," her editor had said, tossing her neatly typed article onto the pile of maybes that would never see the light of day. "But we need something bigger, something with teeth." Teeth. The word rattled in her head as she stared at the blank sheet of paper in her typewriter. What did it even mean? She wanted to scream, but instead, she adjusted her round glasses and leaned back in her chair. The faint scent of old coffee wafted over from the communal pot, mixing with the newsroom's stale air, and her frustrations simmered. That's when she overheard the conversation at the desk behind her. "You remember Marcus Calloway?" One reporter said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "The boxer? The titan?" "Of course," replied another. "Guy was unstoppable, until that fight. Disappeared right after. Heard he's still somewhere in the city. Broke as hell." Amelia froze, her mind racing. Marcus Calloway. The name stirred a faint memory of her father watching boxing matches on their old black and white TV. She remembered the man, hulking, stoic, fists like sledgehammers. He was a legend in the sport. And then, suddenly, he wasn't. The next morning, armed with a notepad and a fierce determination, Amelia began her research. Marcus had been a heavyweight champion in the late 60s and early 70s, a household name. His fights were spectacles, drawing crowds from all over. But his career had ended abruptly after a controversial match where he was accused of throwing the fight. The details were murky, whispers of gambling debts, under-the-table deals, and personal scandals. After that, he had vanished from the public eye. Amelia's fingers flew over her typewriter as she documented the facts. The story had everything her editor could want: fame, scandal, and mystery. It was the kind of exposé that could make her career. But the deeper she dug, the more she found cracks in the narrative. Court documents hinted at disputes between Marcus and his manager, but nothing definitive. Old interviews painted him as a man of integrity, a fighter who valued honor above all. And then there was the personal angle. Marcus had a teenage daughter at the time of his fall from grace. No mention of her existed after his career ended. That detail gnawed at Amelia. Where was she now? Had she been caught up in her father's downfall? The journalist in her sensed a deeper story, one that wasn't just about a disgraced athlete, but about a man who had lost everything: his career, his reputation, and maybe even his family. By the end of the week, Amelia had pieced together a rough timeline of Marcus's life, but it wasn't enough. She needed to hear from the man himself. She needed his side of the story. Through a contact in the boxing community, she tracked him down to a modest apartment in the Bronx. It wasn't easy to convince her editor to greenlight the trip. "Boxers are a dime a dozen," he'd said, brushing her off. "Unless you've got a smoking gun, Amelia, this isn't worth the ink." "I'll find the smoking gun," she shot back, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Just give me a chance." And so on a chilly November afternoon, Amelia found herself standing outside a rundown building with a broken buzzer. She hesitated, clutching her notepad tightly, before pushing the door open and climbing the creaky stairs to the third floor. She rehearsed her introduction in her head. She would be professional but approachable, honest but persistent. When she reached apartment 3B, she knocked twice. No answer. She was about to knock again when the door opened a crack, revealing a man whose presence was both commanding and diminished. Marcus Calloway was taller than she expected, his broad shoulders hunched under a threadbare sweater. His eyes were sharp but tired, and his once powerful frame had softened with age and hardship. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice gravely. "Amelia Reed," she said, offering a tentative smile. "I'm a journalist with the New York Tribune. I'd like to talk to you about your career." Marcus snorted, starting to close the door. "Not interested." "Wait," she blurted, stepping forward. "This isn't about dragging your name through the mud. I want to tell your story, your real story." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "What do you know about my story?" "Not enough," Amelia admitted, her voice softening. "That's why I'm here. I think people deserve to know the truth about what happened to you, about what you lost." For a moment, he said nothing, just stared at her. Then, with a resigned sigh, he opened the door wider. 5 minutes, he said. That's all you're getting. As Amelia stepped inside, she had no idea how deeply this meeting would change both their lives. Marcus Calloway sat on the worn couch in his cramped apartment, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The faint glow of a boxing match replay flickered on the small TV in front of him, though he wasn't really watching. His apartment was a museum of faded glory. A cracked championship belt hung on the wall. A photo of a younger Marcus in the ring rested on a dusty shelf, and a pair of boxing gloves, their leather worn thin, sat unused in the corner. The apartment smelled of stale smoke and old memories. Outside, the sounds of the Bronx filtered through the window. A car horn, laughter from a distant street corner, the occasional shout. Marcus had long since stopped noticing them. He was used to the noise, just as he was used to the silence within. The knock on the door startled him. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. Marcus frowned, rising slowly and setting his glass down. He wasn't expecting anyone. He never expected anyone. Opening the door, he was greeted by the young woman who had interrupted his solitude the day before. Her brown hair was tied back, and she clutched a notepad to her chest like a shield. "You again?" he grunted. "Didn't I tell you 5 minutes?" Amelia Reed smiled nervously. "You did, but you didn't finish, and I didn't ask the right questions." Marcus leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and studied her. She was persistent, he'd give her that. But he didn't trust journalists. He'd been burned before, dragged through the mud by people who cared more about a headline than the truth. "I'm not interested in being your next headline lady," he said, his tone sharp. "This isn't about a headline," she said quickly. "I'm trying to understand the man behind the gloves. The Marcus Calloway who wasn't just a boxer, but a father, a fighter, and a man who," she hesitated, "who lost a lot." The words struck a nerve, though Marcus didn't show it. He stared at her, weighing his options. The easy choice was to slam the door. But something in her eyes, earnest, almost pleading, made him pause. "Fine," he muttered, stepping aside. "You've got your 5 minutes. Sit." Amelia entered cautiously, taking in the cluttered apartment. She perched on the edge of the couch, notepad and pen at the ready. Marcus sat across from her in a creaky chair, his body language stiff and guarded. "So," he said, motioning vaguely, "ask your questions. Get it over with." Amelia glanced at her notes. "You were at the top of your game in 1971, undefeated. Then came the fight against Danny the Machine Harris. People said you threw it. Did you?" Marcus's jaw tightened, his fists clenching reflexively. "I didn't throw a damn thing," he said, his voice low but firm. "But nobody cared what I had to say. They had their story, and they ran with it." "What really happened?" she pressed. Marcus stared at the floor, his eyes darkening with memory. "It wasn't about the fight. It was about the people around me. My manager, the promoters, they were into things I didn't know about until it was too late. Money changed hands, bets were placed, and when I didn't play along, they made sure I'd never fight again." Amelia scribbled furiously but kept her tone gentle. "And your family? Your daughter?" At the mention of Rachel, Marcus's expression hardened. "What about her?" "You left her," Amelia said softly. "Why?" Marcus leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. He ran a hand over his face, his tough exterior momentarily cracking. "I didn't leave her," he said, his voice strained. I thought I was protecting her. Things were messy. People were coming after me. I didn't want her caught up in it." "But she was still your daughter," Amelia said. "Did you ever try to reconnect?" Marcus's silence was answer enough. He looked out the window, his eyes distant. "By the time the dust settled, I wasn't the man she needed me to be. I figured she was better off without me." Amelia's pen hovered over her notepad. "Do you know where she is now?" Marcus shook his head. "Last I heard, she was living with her mother's sister somewhere in Queens. That was years ago." Amelia hesitated before speaking. "If you could see her again, would you?" Marcus looked at her, his face unreadable. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "Maybe, if she'd even want to see me." The vulnerability in his voice surprised her. Here was a man who had spent his life projecting strength, now exposing the cracks in his armor. Amelia saw not just a disgraced athlete, but a man carrying the weight of his choices. "Thank you for sharing this," she said sincerely. Marcus stood, signaling that their time was up. "You got what you came for," he said gruffly. "Now go write whatever you're going to write." Amelia rose, hesitating at the door. "This isn't just about writing a story, Mr. Calloway. I think there's a chance for you to change how this ends." Marcus didn't respond. He simply closed the door behind her, retreating into his world of faded glory and unresolved regrets. But as he sat back down, the glass of whiskey untouched, her words lingered. The alarm blared at 5 a.m., pulling Rachel Calloway from the few restless hours of sleep she had managed. She rubbed her tired eyes, her body heavy with exhaustion. Another day, another shift. The early morning light peeked through the curtains of her tiny Queens apartment, revealing a cluttered kitchen table littered with unpaid bills and schoolwork. Her 7-year-old son, Ethan, was still fast asleep in the other room, his small form curled up under a Spider-Man blanket. Rachel pulled her uniform from the back of a chair, a simple gray polo and black slacks for her job at the diner. She worked there during the day and cleaned offices at night, a grueling routine that left her little time for herself or Ethan. But it was necessary. Life in the city wasn't kind to single mothers, especially not one still dragging the weight of old wounds. By 7 a.m., she was hustling Ethan out the door. His backpack was slung over one shoulder, his face still groggy. "Mom, do I have to go to Mrs. Ramirez's again?" he asked, referring to their neighbor who watched him after school. "I've got to work late tonight," Rachel said, kneeling to adjust his coat. "Mrs. Ramirez will make sure you're okay." Ethan sighed but didn't argue. He was used to this routine. Rachel kissed the top of his head and watched him join the other kids heading to the bus stop before sprinting to catch her train. By the time Rachel's shift ended, her feet ached and her head pounded from the constant clatter of plates and chatter of customers. She had just enough time to grab a coffee before heading to pick up Ethan. As she walked home, she heard the sound of music drifting through the air, lively and full of energy. She turned the corner and saw Javier Cruz, a familiar sight in the neighborhood. Javier was perched on a low wall, his guitar balanced on his knee. His fingers danced over the strings as he sang, a small crowd gathering around him. Children clapped and swayed to the rhythm, and a few adults stopped to toss coins into the open guitar case. Among the children was Ethan, his face lighting up as he danced in place. "Ethan," Rachel called, making her way through the crowd. He ran to her, his grin wide. "Mom, did you see him? He's so good." Rachel smiled warily and looked up at Javier, who was now packing up his guitar. He caught her eye and waved. They had spoken a few times before, quick exchanges during her walks home, but she didn't know much about him beyond his music and his easy charm. "You've got a great kid," Javier said as she approached. "Thanks," Rachel replied. "He loves your music. He talks about it non-stop." "Well, I'm glad someone appreciates it," Javier said with a laugh. "Not everyone's a fan of street performers." Rachel chuckled softly, the weight of her day momentarily lifting. "It's nice to see someone making people smile. The city could use more of that." Javier tilted his head, studying her. "You look like you could use a smile yourself." Rachel shook her head, her smile fading. "I'm fine, just tired." "You don't have to be fine all the time," Javier said gently. "You know, music's not just for kids, it's good for the soul." Rachel didn't reply but appreciated the sentiment. She thanked him and ushered Ethan away, though she couldn't shake the feeling that Javier had seen right through her. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and Ethan found themselves stopping to watch Javier more often. He made a habit of playing near their block, and Ethan adored him. One evening, as Rachel leaned against a lamppost watching Ethan dance, Javier approached her with a hesitant smile. "You ever think about talking to someone about what's weighing you down?" he asked. Rachel frowned. "What makes you think I'm weighed down?" Javier shrugged. "Call it an artist's intuition. You don't talk much, but your eyes say a lot." Rachel hesitated, then sighed. "It's complicated." Javier didn't push, waiting in silence until she spoke again. "I never really had anyone growing up. My dad left when I was a teenager, and my mom wasn't much better. I've spent most of my life trying to keep my head above water." Javier nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And your dad? Do you know where he is?" Rachel's jaw tightened. "No, and I don't care. He made his choice. Sometimes people leave because they think it's the only way to protect the ones they love," Javier said carefully. "Doesn't make it right, but maybe there's more to his story than you know." Rachel shook her head, her tone sharp. I don't need to know his story. He's had plenty of time to come back if he wanted to. Javier didn't argue, but his words lingered. Sometimes closure is worth chasing, even if it's hard. That night, as Rachel lay in bed, her conversation with Javier replayed in her mind. She hated the idea of reopening old wounds, of dredging up a past she'd worked so hard to bury. But deep down, she couldn't deny the tiny flicker of curiosity. What if there was more to her father's story? What if? Rachel pushed the thought aside. She had enough on her plate. Ethan needed her, and she had no time for ghosts. But the past has a way of catching up when you least expect it. Amelia sat in the dim glow of her desk lamp, surrounded by a cluttered mess of newspaper clippings, court records, and hastily scribbled notes. The deeper she dove into Marcus Calloway's life, the messier it became. The man wasn't just a fallen athlete. He was a casualty of a corrupt system, one that had chewed him up and spit him out, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Her discovery began with a court transcript she'd found buried in old archives. Marcus's former manager, a man named Walter Greaves, had been implicated in a string of fixed fights and illegal gambling operations. One of those fights had been Marcus's last. It wasn't that Marcus had thrown the fight, he'd refused, and that refusal had cost him everything. The transcripts painted a picture of betrayal. Greaves had leveraged Marcus's career to cover his debts, pressuring him to lose the fight against Danny Harris. When Marcus didn't comply, Greaves spread rumors of a payoff, ensuring the public would see Marcus as a cheat and his career would crumble. The scandal had been the final blow to Marcus's already tenuous personal life. Then there was Rachel. Amelia's fingers hovered over a faded photo she'd found tucked in an old boxing magazine. It showed Marcus in his prime, his arms slung around a teenage girl with bright eyes and a hesitant smile. Rachel. Her name appeared only a few times in the records, mostly in connection with Marcus's estranged ex-wife. After the scandal, Rachel had disappeared from the narrative entirely. Amelia wondered if Rachel had been collateral damage in Marcus's downfall, or if there was something more. Determined to fill in the gaps, Amelia spent hours following the few breadcrumbs she could find. Finally, she struck gold. A public records search confirmed that Rachel Calloway was alive and living in Queens. Amelia leaned back in her chair, the weight of her discovery settling over her. Rachel was a single mother, working multiple jobs, and she had no idea her father lived just a few subway stops away. The next morning, Amelia sat across from Marcus in his small apartment, her notebook on the table between them. The man looked wearier than ever, the lines on his face deeper, his eyes dull. "You've been busy," Marcus said, nodding toward the notebook. "Would you dig up?" Amelia hesitated. "A lot," she admitted. "I want to share it with you, but it's complicated." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Complicated how?" Amelia sighed, pushing her glasses up her nose. "I know what really happened with Greaves. I know about the fixed fight, about how you refused, and how he destroyed your career to save his own skin." Marcus's expression darkened, but he didn't interrupt. "You were trying to protect your integrity, and you paid the price for it," Amelia continued. "But that's not all. I also found out why you disappeared, why you left your daughter." Marcus's jaw tightened, his gaze dropping to the floor. "That's none of your business." "Maybe not," Amelia said softly. "But if I'm going to write this story, I need the truth. And I think you deserve to tell it, in your own words." Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. "Greaves wasn't just after me," he said finally. "He threatened my family, Rachel, her mom. Said if I didn't play along, they'd pay for it. I thought if I stayed away, kept them out of the spotlight, they'd be safe." "And were they?" Amelia asked. Marcus shook his head. "Rachel's mom wanted nothing to do with me after the scandal. She took Rachel and left. I thought I was doing the right thing, but all I did was lose them both." Amelia felt a pang of sympathy. "What if I told you Rachel's still here, in the city?" Marcus's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "What?" "I found her," Amelia said carefully. "She's in Queens. She has a son. She paused, choosing her words. "She's struggling, but she's doing okay." Marcus stared at her, his face a mix of shock and longing. "You're sure?" Amelia nodded. "I haven't reached out to her. I didn't think it was my place. But if you want to, I can help." The room fell silent as Marcus processed her words. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. You think she'd even want to see me after all these years? I don't know, Amelia admitted, but don't you think it's worth trying? Marcus rubbed a hand over his face, his tough exterior cracking. I don't even know what I'd say to her. Start with the truth, Amelia said gently, and go from there. Later that night, Amelia sat in her own apartment, staring at her laptop screen. Her draft of the article was open, but her fingers hesitated over the keys. The story she was writing could change everything for Marcus. It could clear his name, revive his legacy, but it could also dredge up pain for Rachel, who had worked so hard to move forward. Amelia closed the laptop with a sigh. She wasn't sure what the right thing to do was. But one thing was certain. Marcus deserved a chance to make things right with his daughter, and she was going to help him take it. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the park where Javier Cruz had set up his usual spot. His guitar case lay open at his feet, a scattering of coins and a few crumpled bills inside. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by his infectious energy and heartfelt lyrics. Children clapped, couples leaned against each other, and even the occasional passerby stopped to listen. But tonight, Javier's focus wasn't entirely on his audience. From the corner of his eye, he spotted Rachel Calloway sitting on a bench, her son Ethan perched next to her, giggling as he tapped his feet to the rhythm. Rachel's face was less guarded than usual, her lips curved in a faint smile. Javier finished his song with a flourish and called out, "All right, folks, that's it for now. I'll be back tomorrow with more tunes." The crowd dispersed, but Rachel and Ethan lingered. Javier approached them, slinging his guitar over his shoulder. "Didn't think you'd come by today," he said with a grin. Rachel shrugged. Ethan insisted, "He thinks you're some kind of rock star." Ethan chimed in, "You are. You're like the best ever." Javier laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. "Well, if my #1 fan says so, it must be true." Rachel rolled her eyes, but couldn't help laughing. As Ethan ran off to play nearby, Javier sat down beside her. "You know," he began, "I've been thinking about what you told me the other day, about your dad." Rachel's smile faded, her posture stiffening. "I don't want to talk about that." "I get it," Javier said gently, "but sometimes the things we don't want to talk about are the ones that weigh us down the most." Rachel sighed, staring at her hands. "He left. That's all there is to it. Talking won't change anything." "Maybe not," Javier admitted. "But I've seen what holding on to pain does to people. It eats away at them, and you don't deserve that." Rachel didn't respond, her eyes fixed on Ethan. After a moment, Javier reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. "I've been working on something," he said, flipping through the pages. "A song about healing, about letting go of the past and finding a way forward. I think it could be good for both of us." Rachel looked at him, her brow furrowing. "Both of us?" Javier smiled sheepishly. "Yeah, I've got my own stuff to work through, but I think it might help you too." Rachel hesitated, but something in Javier's tone, earnest, unassuming, made her nod. "All right, let's hear it." Over the next few weeks, Javier and Rachel spent more time together, fine-tuning the song. Ethan often joined them, providing his own unique commentary on the lyrics. As they worked, Rachel began to open up, sharing more about her childhood and the father she had tried so hard to forget. "He wasn't always a bad guy," she admitted one evening as they sat in the park. "When I was little, he was my hero, but when the scandals started, he just left. No explanation, no goodbye." Javier listened intently, his guitar resting on his lap. "Maybe he thought leaving was the only way to protect you." Rachel scoffed. "That's what people say when they don't want to admit they screwed up." "Maybe," Javier said. "But what if he's changed? What if he's been carrying that regret all these years, just like you've been carrying the hurt?" Rachel frowned, unsure how to respond. Javier strummed a soft chord on his guitar, breaking the tension. "Look," he said, "I'm not saying you have to forgive him, but maybe hearing his side could help you let go of some of that weight." Rachel didn't reply, but her silence spoke volumes. One evening, as Javier wrapped up their practice session, a woman approached them. Amelia Reed, carrying her ever-present notebook, looked slightly out of place amidst the park's casual atmosphere. "Javier Cruz?" she asked. "That's me," he said, extending a hand. "And you are?" "Amelia Reed. I'm a journalist working on a story about someone you might know." She glanced at Rachel. "Marcus Calloway." Rachel froze, her expression hardening. I don't want to talk about him. Amelia turned to Javier. I need your help. I think Marcus and Rachel need to meet, but I can't force it. You've got a way of bringing people together. I thought maybe you could help facilitate. Javier looked at Rachel, who was staring daggers at Amelia. It's not my decision, he said carefully. Rachel? No, Rachel said sharply, standing up. I'm not doing this. I don't care what he has to say. Amelia stepped forward. Rachel, I know this is hard, but I've spent weeks with your father. He's not the man you think he is. He's full of regret, and all he wants is a chance to make things right. Rachel's voice trembled with anger. Where was that regret when I was a teenager? When I needed him? Amelia didn't back down. People make mistakes, big ones, but they don't define who we are forever. He's trying to be better. Javier placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder. Rach, this doesn't have to be about him. It can be about you, about finding peace. Rachel hesitated, her defenses cracking under the weight of their words. Finally, she sighed. Fine, but I'm not making any promises. With Javier's help, Amelia arranged the meeting. Javier planned to perform the song they had worked on, hoping it would set the tone for what was sure to be an emotional encounter. As he strummed his guitar, he prayed that the music could bridge the divide between a father and the daughter he had lost. The evening air in the park buzzed with life as Javier Cruz strummed the opening chords of his song. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the familiar sound of his guitar and his warm, inviting voice. Under the soft glow of string lights hung from nearby trees, the scene seemed idyllic. But for Rachel Calloway, who sat near the back of the crowd with Ethan at her side, there was nothing calm about this moment. She hadn't wanted to come. Her stomach churned with anxiety, her mind racing with what-ifs. Amelia's insistence and Javier's gentle persistence had worn her down. But now, as she scanned the crowd, she wasn't sure she could go through with it. Ethan tugged on her sleeve. Mom, why are you so nervous? It's just Javier singing. Rachel forced a smile. It's nothing, sweetheart. Just listen to the music. Unbeknownst to her, Marcus Calloway stood on the other side of the crowd, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. He felt out of place, like a shadow in a world of light. The idea of seeing Rachel again after so many years terrified him, but Amelia had convinced him that this was his chance, a chance he might never get again. Amelia stood a few feet away, her notepad tucked under her arm as she observed the scene. She caught Marcus's eye and gave him a reassuring nod. Then she turned her attention to Javier, who had transitioned into the song he and Rachel had worked on together. The lyrics filled the air, gentle and poignant. The past can cast a shadow, but it doesn't have to stay. If we face the storm together, we can find another way. The crowd swayed to the music, but Rachel sat rigid, her heart pounding. She recognized the song instantly and realized what was happening. Her gaze darted to the edge of the crowd, where she saw him, her father, Marcus. Her breath caught and anger surged through her. Before she could stop herself, she stood and marched toward him. Why are you here? Rachel's voice cut through the music, startling those nearby. Marcus turned, his expression a mix of guilt and hope. Rachel, you don't get to show up here like this, she snapped, her voice shaking. You don't get to pretend you care after all these years. Javier stopped playing, the crowd awkwardly dispersing as they sensed the tension. Ethan stayed rooted in place, watching with wide eyes. Amelia moved closer but stayed silent, letting the moment unfold. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but faltered. I wanted to see you. To explain. Explain? Rachel laughed bitterly. You had decades to explain. Where were you when Mom died? When I had Ethan? When I needed you? I thought I was protecting you, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Protecting me? Rachel's voice rose. By abandoning me? Do you know what that did to me? Marcus's shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. I was wrong. I know I was wrong, but I thought staying away would keep you safe. Rachel shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. You don't get to decide what's best for me. You don't get to walk away and then show up when it's convenient for you. Amelia stepped forward then, her voice steady but compassionate. Rachel, I know you're hurt, and you have every right to be, but I need you to hear the whole story. Rachel turned to Amelia, her eyes blazing. What story? What could possibly justify what he did? Amelia took a deep breath. Your father didn't leave because he didn't care. He left because he thought it was the only way to protect you and your mom. His manager, Walter Greaves, was threatening him. Threatening you. Marcus refused to throw a fight, and it cost him everything. He thought staying away would keep you out of harm's way. Rachel's anger wavered, replaced by confusion and pain. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked Marcus, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you try to fix it?" "I was ashamed," Marcus admitted, his voice breaking. "I thought I'd already failed you. I didn't know how to come back from that." Javier, who had been quietly observing, began to play a soft melody. The sound was calming, almost like a lullaby. He spoke as he played, his voice gentle. "Sometimes we mess up so badly we think we don't deserve another chance," he said, glancing at Marcus. "But we do, and sometimes the people we've hurt need to know we're willing to try, even if it's hard." The music filled the silence that followed, and Rachel wiped a tear from her cheek. She looked at Ethan, who was watching the scene with wide, curious eyes. "Is he my grandpa?" Ethan asked quietly. Rachel's heart ached. She looked at Marcus, who was staring at Ethan with a mixture of awe and sorrow. "Yes," she said finally, her voice soft, "he is." Marcus took a tentative step forward. "Ethan, I've made a lot of mistakes, but if you'll let me, I'd like to get to know you." Ethan looked at his mother, seeking permission. Rachel hesitated, but then nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice trembling. "But this doesn't mean everything's fixed. I don't know if I can forgive you." Marcus nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I understand. I just want a chance to try." As Javier transitioned into another song, the tension eased slightly. Rachel stood next to Ethan, still guarded but no longer seething. Marcus stood a few feet away, his presence tentative but hopeful. Amelia watched from a distance, her heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't a perfect reunion, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start was all you needed. The late afternoon sun bathed the city in a golden glow as Marcus Calloway walked through the bustling streets of Queens, a faint smile on his face. In his hand, he carried a small box wrapped in bright paper, Ethan's favorite colors. A few months ago, the idea of buying a gift for his grandson wouldn't have even crossed his mind. Now it felt like second nature. Ahead of him, Rachel and Ethan waited outside a community arts center, the building alive with music and chatter. Rachel glanced at her father and gave him a small, tentative smile. She still carried some of her hurt, but their time together over the past few months had chipped away at the walls she'd built around her heart. Marcus wasn't the same man she remembered from her childhood, and she was learning to see him as he was now. A man trying his best.